The first thing I became aware of was silk. Impossibly smooth, cool silk sheets sliding against my skin like water. Nothing at all like the scratchy cotton blend I'd bought on clearance from Target 3 years ago, and still hadn't replaced, despite the fraying edges and the persistent stain from that time I'd fallen asleep with red wine on my nightstand. My eyes felt heavy, weighted down with exhaustion that seemed to have seeped into my very bones, and when I finally managed to pry them open, the ceiling above me was wrong, all wrong. A soaring expanse of ornate crown molding painted in soft cream, with delicate gold leaf details that caught the morning light streaming through windows I didn't own, creating patterns of luminescence that danced across a surface far too beautiful to belong to my cramped studio apartment in Brooklyn, where the ceiling had a water stain shaped like Florida, and the landlord had been promising to fix it since the Obama administration. I sat up too quickly, and the room spun in a disorienting kaleidoscope of unfamiliar luxury that made my stomach lurch with a cocktail of panic and nausea, taking in details that my sleep-addled brain struggled to process into anything resembling sense or reason. The bed beneath me was enormous, easily king-sized, possibly even larger than that if such things existed, dressed in those decadent silk sheets in a deep champagne color that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and the headboard was an architectural masterpiece of tufted velvet in midnight blue that extended nearly to the ceiling, giving the whole arrangement the appearance of a throne designed for sleeping. Floor-to-ceiling windows dominated one entire wall, offering a view of manicured grounds that stretched as far as I could see, complete with sculpted hedges, a fountain that belonged in a European palace, and what appeared to be actual peacocks strutting across emerald lawns that looked like they'd been trimmed with scissors by obsessive-compulsive groundskeepers who measured each blade of grass individually. The furniture scattered throughout the cavernous bedroom would have made antique dealers weep with envy. A sitting area, with chairs upholstered in fabric that shimmered between gold and bronze depending on how the light hit them. A vanity with a mirror framed in what I was terrifyingly certain was real gold, and a wardrobe that looked like it had been stolen from Versailles and given a modern update by someone with unlimited funds and impeccable taste. Fresh flowers, actual fresh flowers, not the grocery store carnations I sometimes splurged on when I needed to pretend my life had beauty in it, overflowed from crystal vases on every surface, their perfume mixing with another scent that made my heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a recognition I wasn't ready to acknowledge. That scent, expensive cologne, the kind that probably came in bottles designed by famous artists and cost more per ounce than gold, with notes of bergamot and cedar and something darker, something that spoke of power and danger and sleepless nights, was achingly familiar, because I'd been breathing it in for the past 18 months every single day as I worked at a desk positioned precisely 4 feet from its source. Dante Reznikov's cologne, Dante Reznikov's scent, which meant this was Dante Reznikov's bedroom, and I was lying in Dante Reznikov's bed, wearing a silk nightgown that definitely wasn't mine, because I owned exactly 3 nightgowns, and they were all cotton, and covered in patterns like cartoon cats, or coffee cups with punny sayings, and absolutely none of them felt like liquid moonlight against my skin the way this one did. The panic that had been building in my chest like a storm-gathering force suddenly broke through whatever dam I'd constructed to hold it back, and I threw off those sinfully soft sheets with hands that trembled so badly I could barely control them, my feet hitting a floor made of wood so polished it reflected the room like dark water, rich mahogany or perhaps walnut, the kind of flooring that required a full-time staff just to maintain its mirror-like finish. My work clothes were gone, the practical black slacks and white blouse that constituted my professional uniform, the sensible flats I wore because heels seemed like an unnecessary complication in an office where violence could erupt at any moment, replaced entirely by this nightgown that clung to my curves in ways that made me feel simultaneously vulnerable and somehow more powerful than I'd ever felt in my carefully constructed armor of corporate respectability. The last coherent memory I could grasp was sitting at my desk in Dante's office suite, surrounded by financial reports and shipping manifests and documents that required my attention because that was my job. That was what I did. I was Isla Moretti, executive assistant to one of the most dangerous men in New York. And I'd been working late because there was always more work, always another crisis, always another fire to put out in an organization that ran on secrets and violence and money that flowed through channels I'd learned not to examine too closely. I'd been so tired, exhausted down to my cellular level from weeks of late nights and early mornings and the constant vigilance required to work for a man who noticed everything, whose steel-gray eyes missed nothing, who expected perfection because anything less could result in death. And I remembered my eyes growing heavy, the numbers on the spreadsheet blurring together, my head dipping forward despite my best efforts to stay alert and professional and indispensable. And then nothing, just a blank space where memory should be, followed by waking up here in this palace of a bedroom wearing clothes I'd never seen before, and the implications of that sent fresh waves of terror cascading through my nervous system, because someone had undressed me, someone had put me in this nightgown, someone had carried me from my desk to this bed, and in my world, in the world I'd inhabited for the past 18 months, since I'd foolishly accepted a job that paid 3 times my previous salary, without asking enough questions about what that salary was compensating me for, that kind of vulnerability could be fatal. The door loomed before me like a choice I wasn't ready to make. Solid wood that probably weighed more than I did, with a handle of brushed brass that felt cool under my palm when I finally worked up the courage to touch it. Expecting resistance. Expecting the solid click of a lock that would confirm my worst fears about captivity and imprisonment and the various horrible fates that befell women who saw too much in organizations like Dante's. But the handle turned smoothly, easily, the door swinging open without protest to reveal a hallway that somehow managed to be even more intimidating than the bedroom I was fleeing. All soaring ceilings and artwork that belonged in museums, and lighting fixtures that probably cost more than my student loans, which was saying something considering I'd financed 4 years at NYU with the kind of debt that would follow me to my grave. Guards lined the hallway at regular intervals, men I recognized from the office, built like brick walls and dressed in suits that didn't quite conceal the weapons I knew they carried. And every single one of them nodded at me as I passed as though my presence here was expected. Normal, as though young women regularly wandered through this mansion in borrowed nightgowns, looking lost and terrified and completely out of their depth. No one moved to stop me, no one questioned my right to be here, and somehow that acceptance felt more threatening than if they'd dragged me back to the bedroom and locked me inside, because it suggested that wherever I went in this place, I was exactly where someone wanted me to be. A piece positioned, deliberately on a chessboard I didn't understand by a player whose strategy I couldn't begin to comprehend. The hallway opened onto a grand staircase that would have made Gone with the Wind jealous. A sweeping cascade of marble steps, with a wrought iron railing that featured metalwork so delicate and intricate it looked like frozen lace. And I descended slowly, my bare feet silent on stone that felt like ice, one hand gripping the railing so tightly my knuckles went white because the alternative was to collapse right there on the stairs and refuse to take another step toward whatever waited for me at the bottom. The foyer below spread out like a cathedral, all soaring space and natural light that poured through windows designed to make the inhabitants feel small and insignificant. And I could see doorways leading off in multiple directions, each one probably opening onto rooms I couldn't afford to set foot in, let alone own, in a dozen lifetimes of saving my assistant's salary. But I didn't have to wonder which direction to take because I could hear the rustle of newspaper pages, that distinctive sound of broadsheet being folded and turned, coming from somewhere to my left, and I followed it like a moth to flame, through an archway into a breakfast room that managed to be both intimate and grand, with French doors opening onto a terrace and a table set for 2 with china so fine it was nearly translucent, crystal that caught the light and threw rainbows across the walls, and silverware that was probably actual silver, the kind that required polishing and came with its own felt-lined storage cases. And there, sitting at the head of that table like a king presiding over his domain, dressed in casual clothes I'd never seen him wear, dark slacks and a crisp white shirt, with the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that my traitorous brain noticed were strongly muscled and dusted with dark hair. Was Dante Reznikov, my boss, my employer, the man I'd spent 18 months trying desperately not to notice was devastatingly attractive beneath the aura of danger that surrounded him like a second skin. He was reading the morning paper with the same focused intensity he brought to everything he did, his dark hair still slightly damp from what must have been a morning shower, and he didn't look up immediately when I entered, letting me stand there in my borrowed nightgown, feeling exposed and vulnerable and terrifyingly aware of how little separated my skin from his gaze. When he finally lifted his eyes from the newspaper, those gray eyes that could turn from warm pewter to cold steel in a heartbeat, that could strip away every defense and see straight through to the truth you were trying to hide. I felt the impact like a physical touch, like he'd reached across the distance between us and laid his hand against my throat to feel my pulse hammering out my fear and confusion, and something else I absolutely refused to name. His expression revealed nothing. Perfectly controlled in that way, he'd mastered so completely that I sometimes wondered if he felt anything at all beneath that carefully constructed exterior. But there was something in the set of his jaw, the slight tension around his eyes, that suggested this conversation mattered more than he wanted to admit. That whatever was about to happen would change everything between us in ways neither of us could predict or control. "Good morning, Isla," he said, his voice carrying that faint accent that spoke of a childhood somewhere in Eastern Europe before he'd built his empire here in America. Smooth and cultured and utterly devastatingly calm, as though finding his assistant wandering through his private residence in a nightgown was something that happened every Tuesday, as though this whole bizarre situation was somehow normal and reasonable and didn't require the screaming panic attack I could feel building in my chest. "I trust you slept well," he continued, setting down his newspaper with deliberate care, each movement controlled and purposeful in a way that reminded me exactly who and what he was, beneath the expensive clothes and cultured manners. "We have much to discuss about your new living arrangements." Living arrangements. Those two words hung in the air between us like a threat and a promise, and a complete upheaval of everything I'd thought I understood about my life. And I realized with a clarity that cut through my confusion like a knife that nothing would ever be the same again, that whatever line I'd unknowingly crossed by falling asleep at my desk had brought me here to this moment, standing in Dante Reznikov's breakfast room, wearing his nightgown, while he calmly informed me that I apparently lived here now. And the only question remaining was whether I would survive long enough to understand why. The words, living arrangements, echoed in my head like a death knell, bouncing around inside my skull with all the subtlety of a gunshot in an empty cathedral. And I found myself frozen in the doorway of his breakfast room, unable to move forward into whatever trap this was, and equally unable to retreat back up those grand stairs to the bedroom that smelled like him, that carried his presence in every thread of those silk sheets. Because retreat would mean admitting I was afraid, and I'd learned in 18 months of working for Dante Reznikov that showing fear was the fastest way to lose whatever precarious respect I'd managed to earn in an organization where women were typically decorative at best and disposable at worst. My fingers clutched at the silk nightgown, bunching the fabric at my thighs in a gesture that was probably more revealing than concealing. And I forced myself to meet his gaze, even though everything in me wanted to look away from those gray eyes that seemed to see through skin and bone straight into the terrified, confused core of me that had no idea what game we were playing or what rules governed this new reality I'd woken into. "Living arrangements," I repeated, and my voice came out stronger than I'd expected, carrying an edge of challenge that surprised us both, if the slight lift of his eyebrow was any indication. Because assistants didn't challenge Dante Reznikov, employees didn't question his decisions, and people who valued their continued existence certainly didn't stand in his private breakfast room in borrowed nightclothes and demand explanations as though they had any right to them. "I have living arrangements, Mr. Reznikov. I have an apartment in Brooklyn with a lease and furniture, and a life that I'm fairly certain I didn't agree to abandon when I accepted a position as your executive assistant. So perhaps you'd like to explain exactly what you mean by that statement, and more importantly, explain what the hell I'm doing in your house wearing clothes I've never seen before with no memory of how I got here." Something flickered across his face. Too fast for me to identify. Gone before I could determine if it was amusement or irritation or approval, or some combination of all three. And he gestured to the chair positioned at his right hand, a clear command disguised as an invitation, the kind of subtle manipulation he excelled at, where you thought you had a choice, right up until you realized you'd already done exactly what he wanted. "Sit, Isla," he said, and there was something in his voice that made it impossible to refuse. Not the threat of violence that I'd heard him use with others, but something softer, and somehow more compelling. A tone that suggested he was asking me to trust him, even though we both knew trust was a commodity in short supply in his world. "And I'll explain everything. Though I suspect you already know more than you realize. That brilliant mind of yours has already started putting together pieces of a puzzle you didn't know existed until you woke up in my bedroom this morning." I moved to the chair because refusing seemed pointless, and because my legs were shaking badly enough that sitting down before I collapsed seemed like the wiser choice. And the moment I settled into the plush upholstery, a man I recognized as Dante's personal chef appeared from nowhere with a plate of breakfast that looked like it had been photographed for a magazine spread. Perfectly poached eggs with hollandaise that caught the light like liquid gold. Fresh fruit arranged with artistic precision. Pastries that released clouds of butter-scented steam when I broke them open, despite my insistence to myself that I was too nervous to eat. Dante waited until the chef had retreated, until we were alone again in this intimate space with morning sunlight streaming through French doors and the distant sound of fountains creating a soundtrack of normalcy that felt obscene given the circumstances. And then he leaned back in his chair with the languid grace of a predator, completely confident in his dominance, his control, his absolute authority over this situation, and probably over me as well, though I wasn't ready to admit that particular truth even to myself. "3 nights ago, you were working late," he began, his voice taking on the cadence of someone telling a story they'd rehearsed, though his eyes never left mine, tracking every micro-expression that crossed my face, with the intensity of someone reading a document that contained all the secrets of the universe. Going through the financial reports for our shipping operations, the legitimate ones and the others, the ones that move through channels we've carefully constructed to appear normal to anyone who doesn't know what they're looking at. And you found discrepancies. The word hung between us, heavy with implications, and my stomach dropped because I did remember, suddenly, and with perfect clarity. I remembered finding numbers that didn't add up. Shipments that appeared in one ledger but not another. Money flowing in directions that made no sense given what I understood about the organization's structure. And I'd thought about bringing it to his attention, but it had been late, and I'd been tired, and I'd decided to compile a more complete report before bothering him with what might have been nothing. Might have been simple accounting errors. Might have been anything other than what his tone suggested it actually was. "The discrepancies weren't errors," he continued, watching me with an intensity that made my skin flush hot and cold simultaneously. "They were theft, systematic and sophisticated theft that had been going on for almost 2 years, siphoning millions from operations and funneling them into accounts controlled by 3 of my senior lieutenants, who apparently decided that my organization would function better under different leadership. Preferably leadership that consisted of them, and definitely leadership that didn't include me breathing." His voice remained perfectly level as he described what amounted to a death sentence for the men involved, as casual as if he were discussing the weather or the stock market or anything other than the kind of betrayal that in his world resulted in bodies that were never found and families that learned not to ask questions. And I felt ice water replace the blood in my veins because I'd stumbled onto something that could have gotten me killed, that probably should have gotten me killed, that by all the rules I'd learned about how his world operated should have resulted in me disappearing into the East River, wearing concrete shoes like something out of a dark parody of a mob movie. You fell asleep at your desk while compiling evidence of their conspiracy, Dante said. And now there was something in his voice that might have been concern if I didn't know better. If I hadn't spent 18 months learning that Dante Reznikov didn't do concern, didn't allow himself the vulnerability of caring about people, because caring created weaknesses that could be exploited by the various enemies constantly circling his empire looking for any crack in his armor. Collapsed from exhaustion after 3 consecutive days of working 16-hour shifts, because you're incapable of doing anything halfway. Because when you commit to something, you commit completely, even when that commitment is to an organization you must know is built on blood and violence and moral compromises that would horrify the person you probably thought you'd become when you were studying business administration at NYU. The fact that he knew where I'd gone to college shouldn't have surprised me. Dante knew everything about everyone in his orbit, conducted background checks that would make the FBI jealous, probably knew my social security number and my childhood address and every secret I'd ever tried to keep hidden. But hearing him reference it so casually reminded me that privacy was an illusion in his world, that working for him meant accepting that he owned not just my time but access to every aspect of my history, my present, and possibly my future if I survived whatever this conversation was building toward. I found you unconscious at your desk with your laptop open to a spreadsheet that proved beyond any doubt that Victor, Sergei, and Konstantin had been planning a coup, he said. And I noticed that he didn't use their last names, didn't afford them the respect of full identification, because they'd betrayed him. And in his world, betrayal erased your right to be considered fully human, fully worthy of the courtesies that separated civilization from chaos. And I had a choice to make in that moment, Isla, a choice about what to do with an assistant who'd accidentally uncovered a conspiracy that I'd missed, that had been happening right under my nose while I was distracted with expansion into new territories and negotiations with families that wanted to challenge my control of the port operations. His jaw tightened, the first real sign of emotion breaking through that controlled exterior, and I realized with a jolt that he was angry. Not at me, but at himself, at the men who'd betrayed him, at the situation that had put me in danger without my knowledge or consent. And that anger was somehow more frightening than any threat he could have made because it suggested depths to him I hadn't allowed myself to consider. Complexity beneath the ruthless crime lord facade that made him human in ways I desperately didn't want to acknowledge. You could have killed me, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. Clear and direct, despite the fear crawling up my spine like frost spreading across a window. That's what you do with people who know too much, who see things they shouldn't, who become liabilities to your operations and your security. So why am I sitting here eating breakfast in your private residence instead of decomposing in a landfill somewhere in Jersey? Because I've worked for you long enough to know that sentiment doesn't factor into your business decisions and I'm just an employee, easily replaced, certainly not worth the risk of leaving alive when I could potentially testify against you, or sell information to your competitors, or become leverage for any of the dozen organizations that would love to have something to hold over your head. The words tumbled out in a rush, 18 months of unspoken knowledge finally finding voice. The reality of what I'd signed up for when I'd accepted his job offer laid bare between us, without the comfortable fiction of plausible deniability that had allowed me to cash those generous paychecks without examining too closely where the money came from or what crimes it represented. Dante was quiet for a long moment, studying me with an expression I couldn't read, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made every word feel like a stone dropping into still water, sending ripples outward that would change the entire surface of what existed between us. You're not just an employee, Isla, and you haven't been for months. Perhaps you never were from the moment you walked into my office for your interview wearing a suit you'd bought specifically for the occasion, and shoes that were stylish but practical because you'd researched me enough to know that I value efficiency over flash, competence over beauty, though you happen to possess both in measures that have made the past 18 months significantly more complicated than they should have been. The admission hung in the air between us, unexpected and dangerous, and loaded with implications that made my heart hammer against my ribs like it was trying to escape my chest, and I found myself unable to breathe properly, unable to process what he was saying because it sounded almost like a confession, almost like he was admitting to feeling something for me beyond professional appreciation, and that couldn't be right because men like Dante Reznikov didn't develop feelings for their assistants, didn't blur the lines between business and personal, didn't risk the complications that would inevitably arise from acknowledging attraction in an environment where any weakness could be fatal. "I'm offering you a choice," he continued, leaning forward now, his elbows on the table, his attention focused on me with such intensity that I felt pinned in place like a butterfly in a collector's display, beautiful and trapped and utterly at the mercy of forces beyond my control. "You can stay here, in my home, under my protection, with complete access to every aspect of my organization, knowing all the secrets and being part of all the decisions, working not just as my assistant, but as my partner in running an empire that spans continents and generates more money in a month than most people see in lifetimes, or you can disappear." The word disappear could mean so many things in his world, could mean witness protection, or could mean a shallow grave, could mean a new identity in a distant city, or could mean the kind of permanent silence that ensured secrets stayed buried, and I found myself searching his face for clues about which interpretation he intended, whether this was truly a choice or just the illusion of one, whether I would leave this breakfast room alive regardless of what answer I gave, or whether my survival depended on choosing correctly, on reading his intentions accurately, on understanding what he wanted from me even if he couldn't or wouldn't state it plainly. "Why?" I asked, because that seemed like the only question that mattered, the only thing that could help me navigate this impossible situation. Why give me any choice at all when you could simply ensure my silence permanently? Why bring me into your home instead of keeping me contained somewhere you can control me completely? Why offer me partnership when trust is the one commodity you can't afford in your world? The one luxury that could get you killed as surely as the betrayal you just uncovered? My hands were shaking where they rested on the table, trembling so badly that I had to curl them into fists to hide the visible evidence of my fear, and I watched his gaze drop to track the movement, watched something flicker in his eyes that might have been approval, or might have been hunger, or might have been both. And I realized with dawning horror that this wasn't just about business, wasn't just about containing a security threat or managing a liability, but about something far more dangerous, far more complicated, far more likely to destroy us both than any conspiracy or coup attempt ever could. "Because," Dante said, and his voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, intimate and rough and filled with an honesty that seemed to cost him something to produce. "In 18 months of having you in my office, of watching you handle crisis after crisis with grace and intelligence, of seeing you navigate my world without losing yourself, or compromising your principles even when it would have been easier and safer to simply stop asking questions and stop caring about the answers, I've come to realize that you're the first person in a decade who I might actually be able to trust. And trust, Isla, is more valuable to me than all the money we move through those shipping channels, more precious than all the territory I control, more essential than anything else I've built. Because without someone I can trust absolutely, someone who sees me clearly and chooses to stay anyway, I'm just a king sitting alone on a throne surrounded by subjects who would murder me the moment they thought they could get away with it." The confession stripped away every defense I'd constructed, every wall I'd built between myself and the dangerous attraction I'd been fighting since the first time he'd smiled at me over morning coffee. And I felt something crack open inside my chest, something that had been locked away for self-preservation purposes suddenly exposed to air and light and the terrifying possibility that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the only one who'd spent 18 months pretending that the electricity crackling between us every time we occupied the same space was just professional chemistry, just the natural rapport between an effective boss and a competent assistant, just anything other than what it actually was. Before I could formulate a response, before I could even begin to process the magnitude of what he'd just revealed, the door to the breakfast room burst open with enough force to rattle the china, and Dante's second in command, a man named Mikhail, who I'd always found vaguely threatening in the way that career criminals who were very good at their jobs tended to be threatening, strode in with an expression that made my blood run cold, made every instinct I possessed scream danger in capital letters, and when he spoke, his voice carried an urgency that suggested whatever he was about to say would change everything again, would transform this already surreal morning into something even more impossible to process or survive. "Boss?" Mikhail said, his accent thicker than Dante's, his eyes flicking to me briefly before returning to his employer, with the kind of respect that came from genuine fear rather than mere deference. "We have a problem. The traders didn't work alone. They had outside backing from the Calabrese family, and when they learned about the failed coup attempt, when they realized we'd discovered their involvement, they grabbed the sister. They took Isla's sister Mira from her apartment an hour ago, and they're demanding your complete surrender and control of the port operations in exchange for her life." The world tilted sideways, reality fracturing into sharp-edged pieces that cut me as they fell, and I heard myself make a sound that wasn't quite human, wasn't quite a scream, but something more primal, something that came from a place so deep inside me that I hadn't known it existed until this moment when everything I'd been trying to protect, everyone I'd been working myself to exhaustion to support, was suddenly in the hands of people who wouldn't hesitate to hurt her, to use her, to destroy her simply to make a point about power and leverage and the cost of crossing families that had been spilling blood on American soil since before my grandparents were born. Mira, my baby sister, 20 years old and so bright it hurt to look at her sometimes, studying pre-med at Columbia on scholarships that covered tuition, but not living expenses, which was why I'd taken this job in the first place, why I'd accepted a position that paid obscenely well while requiring me to ignore the source of those paychecks, why I'd spent 18 months pretending I didn't know exactly what kind of man signed my direct deposits every 2 weeks, and now she was paying the price for my choices, my compromises, my willingness to work for a monster, even if that monster had gray eyes that sometimes looked at me like I was something precious instead of something expendable. I was on my feet before I'd made a conscious decision to move, the chair I'd been sitting in clattering backward with enough force to crack against the wall, and I rounded on Dante with a fury that burned through the shock, through the fear, through every instinct that told me confronting him was dangerous because nothing mattered except Mira, except getting her back, except undoing whatever I'd done by falling asleep at my desk and stumbling into a conspiracy that had apparently been connected to something much larger, much more dangerous than simple internal theft. "You have to get her back," I said, and my voice came out raw, stripped of the professional polish I'd cultivated so carefully, reduced to nothing but desperation and rage and the kind of pain that made breathing feel like an accomplishment. "You have to fix this right now because she has nothing to do with your world, with any of this. She's just a kid trying to get through medical school and help people, and she doesn't even know what you really do, doesn't know what I really do for you. And if they hurt her, if they touch one hair on her head, I swear to God, I will burn your entire organization to the ground, even if I have to die doing it. Even if it takes my last breath and the last drop of blood in my body. I will make you pay for bringing this into her life." Dante had gone absolutely still in that way he had when violence was imminent, when the civilized veneer he wore like expensive cologne was about to crack and reveal the predator underneath, and his eyes had turned to cold steel. All traces of the vulnerability he'd shown me just moments ago vanished as completely as if it had never existed, replaced by the calculating ruthlessness that had built his empire and maintained it against countless challengers who'd thought they could take what he'd claimed as his own. "Sit down, Isla," he said, and his voice carried a command that made Mikhail actually take a step backward. Recognition that we were in dangerous territory now, that the boss was in the mode where people died for minor infractions, and major ones resulted in consequences that haunted the nightmares of anyone who witnessed them. But I was beyond caring about his moods, beyond worrying about whether I was crossing lines that couldn't be uncrossed, beyond everything except the image of Mira's face, her smile, the way she'd hugged me last Sunday when I'd taken her to brunch and promised her that everything would be fine, that I had her tuition covered, that she should focus on her studies and let me worry about the money. "I won't sit down," I said, my hands clenching into fists at my sides, nails digging crescents into my palms that would probably leave marks. But I needed the pain. Needed something to anchor me to reality when everything felt like it was spinning into chaos. "I won't sit here and eat breakfast and discuss this calmly while my sister is with people who kill for a living. While she's terrified and alone and probably thinking I've abandoned her. Wondering why her big sister, who promised to always protect her, hasn't come to save her yet. So you need to tell me right now what you're going to do to get her back. Because if your answer is anything other than everything possible, if you're about to explain that she's just collateral damage in your war with the Calabrese family, if you're going to tell me that sacrificing one innocent girl is acceptable losses in the grand scheme of your business operations, then you should probably kill me right now, because I will spend every remaining moment of my life making you regret that decision." Something shifted in his expression, some crack in the armor that let me see through to whatever existed beneath the crime lord exterior. And he rose from his chair with a fluid grace that reminded me he wasn't just dangerous because of the power he wielded, but because he was personally, physically capable of extreme violence. His body a weapon he'd honed through years of surviving, in a world where weakness meant death and mercy was a luxury reserved for people who could afford the consequences. He closed the distance between us in 3 strides, and I should have stepped back, should have maintained the space that had always existed between employer and employee, between crime boss and assistant, between the man who ordered deaths over morning coffee and the woman who scheduled those meetings and pretended not to understand what was really being discussed. But I held my ground even when he invaded what should have been my personal space, even when I had to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact, even when I could feel the heat radiating off his body and smell that cologne that had perfumed the bedroom where I'd woken up wearing his nightgown. "Listen to me very carefully," Dante said, his voice pitched low enough that only I could hear. Intimate despite the fury I could see banked in his eyes like coals waiting for oxygen to transform them into an inferno. "Your sister will be returned to you unharmed, I give you my word. And in my world, in the world I've built through blood and strategy, and refusing to accept defeat even when victory seemed impossible, my word is the only currency that matters more than money or territory or power, because the moment people believe I won't honor my commitments is the moment my empire begins to crumble from within." His hands came up as though he wanted to touch me, to grip my shoulders or cut my face or pull me against him. But he stopped himself at the last second, fingers curling into fists that mirrored mine, and I saw the restraint that cost him. Saw him fighting against instincts that probably told him to comfort through physical contact, but knowing that touching me right now would cross boundaries that couldn't be uncrossed, would acknowledge feelings that were dangerous. For both of us to admit even to ourselves, much less to each other, or to Mikhail, who was still standing in the doorway, watching this interaction with poorly concealed fascination. "The Calabrese family made a critical miscalculation when they took someone you love," he continued. And there was something in the way he emphasized "you" that made my breath catch. Made me wonder if he was really talking about the strategic implications of kidnapping his assistant's sister, or if he was saying something else entirely. Something about what it meant that they'd hurt someone who mattered to me, and by extension how that created a personal investment for him that went beyond business calculations and strategic considerations. Because now this isn't just about territory or money, or their wounded pride over backing a failed coup attempt. Now this is about the fact that they've declared war on me by targeting someone under my protection, and I don't lose wars, Isla. I end them so decisively that no one else is ever stupid enough to challenge me the same way again. The promise in his words should have frightened me, should have reminded me exactly what kind of man I was standing so close to, what he was capable of when someone crossed the lines he'd drawn around what belonged to him. But instead I felt something that might have been relief, or might have been something darker. Something that recognized the justice in his particular brand of ruthlessness, in the certainty that whoever had taken Mira would regret that decision in ways that would make them beg for the mercy of a quick death. The next hours passed in a blur of activity that would have been fascinating if I hadn't been drowning in terror for my sister. watching Dante transform from the man who'd been confessing complicated feelings over breakfast into a general marshaling his forces for a war that would reshape the criminal landscape of New York. And I saw for the first time the full scope of what he controlled, the network of soldiers and informants and corrupt officials who owed him favors or feared his retribution or both, all of them moving with the precision of a military operation, because that's essentially what it was, an army preparing to assault enemy territory and extract a hostage while sending a message that would echo through every family, every organization, every crew that thought they might want to test Dante Reznikov's resolve or challenge his authority. He'd given me a choice, told me I could retreat to the bedroom and wait while he handled everything, but I'd refused with enough vehemence that he'd simply nodded once and accepted my presence, allowing me to sit in the corner of his war room, because of course he had a literal war room, complete with maps and surveillance equipment, and enough weapons to outfit a small militia, and watch as he planned an operation that balanced the need to rescue Mira with the strategic imperative to make the Calabrese family regret they'd ever been born. I saw him consult with men who looked like they'd stepped out of nightmares, specialists in various forms of violence who discussed extraction techniques and optimal firing positions with the casual expertise of people who'd done this kind of thing so many times it had become routine. And I saw him reject plan after plan because the risk to Mira was too high, because the chance of casualties among the civilians in the building where they were holding her was unacceptable, because despite what I'd thought I knew about him, despite 18 months of witnessing his ruthlessness in business dealings and territorial disputes, he actually cared about minimizing collateral damage when possible, actually drew lines that he wouldn't cross even when crossing them would make his objectives easier to achieve. He caught me watching him during one of these exchanges, during a moment when he'd vetoed a plan that would have guaranteed success, but would have likely resulted in the deaths of families who lived in the building where Mira was being held. And something passed between us. Some wordless communication that said more than any conversation could have. Some acknowledgement that maybe I didn't know him as well as I thought I did. That maybe the monster I'd convinced myself I was working for was more complicated than the simple villain narrative I'd constructed to make sense of my choices. "You should eat something," Dante said during a brief lull in the planning, materializing beside me with a sandwich and bottled water that someone must have brought in while I was lost in the horror scenarios my imagination kept constructing, each one featuring Mira scared or hurt or worse. And I shook my head because the thought of food made my stomach revolt, made me want to scream at him that I couldn't eat while my sister was with people who might be hurting her right now. But he pressed the water bottle into my hands with enough insistence that I took it if only to stop him from hovering, from showing this concern that made it harder to maintain the emotional distance I needed to survive whatever came next. "She's alive and unharmed," he said quietly, anticipating my unspoken question, reading my fear with the same accuracy he applied to reading financial reports or strategic situations. "They contacted us an hour ago with proof of life, and while they're many things, most of them reprehensible, the Calabrese family isn't stupid enough to damage their only leverage before negotiations are complete. So whatever you're imagining right now, whatever worst-case scenarios are playing out in your mind, you can set those aside and focus on the fact that by this time tomorrow, you'll be having coffee with your sister, and this will be a bad memory that gets less sharp with time even if it never completely fades." "How can you be so calm?" I asked, and I genuinely wanted to know. Wanted to understand how he could project this absolute certainty when everything felt like it was balanced on a knife's edge, when one wrong move could result in Mira's death and would definitely result in a bloodbath that would make the evening news and probably trigger federal investigations that even his corrupt contacts couldn't fully contain. How can you sit there and plan this operation like it's just another business deal when a girl's life hangs in the balance, when failure isn't just a financial loss, but means I'll have to bury my sister and live with the knowledge that she died because of choices I made, because I took a job working for you without thinking through all the possible consequences, without considering that maybe the high salary came with costs I couldn't anticipate and wouldn't be able to pay." The words came out sharper than I'd intended, accusations mixing with genuine curiosity, and I saw him flinch almost imperceptibly. saw my barb land in whatever part of him was capable of being wounded by the judgments of others. And I felt a flash of guilt, immediately followed by anger at myself for feeling guilty when my sister was missing, and he was at least partially responsible for the circumstances that had led to her kidnapping. I'm calm because panic accomplishes nothing except poor decision-making and innocent people dying, Dante replied, his voice remaining level despite whatever my words had cost him. I'm calm because I've been in situations like this before, because I've had to rescue people from enemies who wanted to use them as leverage, because I understand the psychology of kidnappers and the strategic calculations involved in hostage negotiations, and I know that the appearance of control, of absolute confidence in the outcome, actually increases the probability of success by making the enemy doubt their position, by making them wonder if maybe they've miscalculated, if maybe they've underestimated what I'm willing to do to protect what's mine. The way he said mine sent shivers down my spine that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the possessiveness in his tone. The implication that somewhere in the past 18 months, or perhaps in the past 18 hours since I'd woken up in his bedroom, I'd transitioned from employee to something else, something that came with protection but also with claims of ownership that should have infuriated me, but instead made me feel safer than I'd felt since Mikhail had delivered the news that shattered my world. The planning continued through the afternoon and into evening, and at some point someone brought me actual clothes. Not my work attire, but new things, expensive things that fit perfectly, because of course Dante knew my measurements, probably had known them since before he'd hired me because that's the kind of thoroughness he applied to everything. And I changed in an attached bathroom, while voices in the war room discussed entry points and extraction routes and contingency plans for various scenarios, each one more violent than the last. When I emerged wearing dark jeans and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my monthly rent, Dante's eyes tracked over me with an appreciation that he didn't bother to hide, and I saw several of his men notice the look, and then very carefully not react to it, pretending they hadn't just witnessed their boss looking at his assistant like she was something considerably more than an employee, like she was something worth the risk he was about to take, worth the war he was about to start, worth whatever consequences would ripple out from this night's actions into the complicated future we were constructing, whether we intended to or not. It's time, Mikhail said as the sun finished setting beyond the windows, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed obscene given what we were about to do. And Dante rose from his position at the head of the table, where he'd been coordinating the final details, his movements carrying the coiled tension of violence about to be unleashed, and he looked at me with an expression that asked a question he didn't voice. Whether I was going to stay here where it was safe, or whether I was going to insist on coming along, despite the danger, despite his obvious preference that I remain behind, where he didn't have to worry about protecting me, in addition to executing a complicated extraction operation. I'm coming, I said, before he could ask, before he could try to convince me otherwise. And I saw resignation flash across his face mixed with something that might have been pride, might have been approval that I wasn't content to sit passively while others fought my battles, while men risked their lives to save my sister because I'd made choices that had consequences I hadn't anticipated. And he nodded once, a sharp acknowledgement that said more than words about what he thought of my decision, about what it meant that I was willing to walk into danger beside him. The drive to the location where they were holding Mira took 30 minutes through traffic that Dante's driver navigated with the kind of aggressive precision that suggested this wasn't his first emergency extraction. And I sat in the back of an armored SUV that was probably bulletproof, pressed against Dante's side because the vehicle was crowded with armed men and equipment, and I could feel the tension radiating off him in waves, could feel the way his muscles were coiled like springs waiting to be released. And when his hand found mine in the darkness of the vehicle, fingers lacing through mine with a certainty that suggested this was something we did, something natural and right, and not at all complicated by the fact that he was my boss and a criminal, and currently on his way to commit what would undoubtedly be multiple felonies in the process of rescuing my sister. "Whatever happens tonight," he said quietly, his lips close enough to my ear that his breath ghosted across my skin, and made me shiver for reasons that had nothing to do with temperature. Whatever you see me do or order done, I need you to remember that everything, every action, every decision, every moment of violence that's about to occur, all of it is because you matter to me in ways that terrify me, in ways that make me vulnerable, in ways that should make me send you away for your own safety and mine, but that instead make me willing to burn down half the city, if that's what it takes to bring your sister home safely, and keep you from experiencing the kind of grief that never fully heals, that follows you through all your remaining days and colors every moment with the shadow of loss. Before I could respond, before I could even begin to process what he'd just admitted in a car full of his soldiers who were pretending very hard not to hear this confession, we arrived at the building, and all thoughts of complicated feelings and dangerous attractions and the way his hand felt wrapped around mine vanished in the face of what came next, the carefully coordinated assault, the precision violence of professionals doing what they did best. The terror and relief of seeing Mira stumble out of the building, supported by one of Dante's men, crying but alive and apparently unharmed, and the moment when I broke free from the restraining hand Dante had kept on my arm and ran to her, pulling her into my arms while she sobbed against my shoulder, and I made promises I probably couldn't keep about safety and protection and never letting anything like this happen again, all while behind us, the building erupted into flames that would ensure the Calabrese family received Dante's message loud and clear, painted in fire and blood, and the kind of ruthless efficiency that reminded everyone watching why you didn't cross Dante Reznikov, and definitely didn't touch the things he'd decided belonged to him. The safe house where Dante's men brought us after the extraction was nothing like the mansion I'd woken up in that morning a lifetime ago, though the clock insisted only 14 hours had passed since I'd opened my eyes to silk sheets and impossible luxury, and instead felt more like a fortress designed by someone who understood that true safety came not from beauty, but from strategic advantages like reinforced walls and security systems that would make government installations jealous, and enough armed guards to repel a small army, which given the circumstances was probably exactly what Dante expected might come looking for us before the night ended. Mira clung to me with a desperation that broke something inside my chest, her entire body shaking with tremors she couldn't control, and I held her while EMTs that Dante had somehow produced from thin air checked her for injuries, pronounced her physically unharmed, but recommended therapy for the psychological trauma. And I wanted to scream at them that therapy required time and safety, and the luxury of processing events rather than simply surviving them, none of which seemed likely given that we were currently hiding in an underground bunker, while Dante orchestrated what I could only assume was a full-scale war against the family that had taken her, had threatened her, had used her as a pawn in games she didn't understand and shouldn't have been anywhere near. "I'm so sorry," I whispered against her hair, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo mixed with fear sweat and the lingering odor of wherever they'd kept her. Some basement or warehouse that had probably smelled like mold in desperation, and the guilt threatened to drown me because this was my fault. My choices had led to this. My decision to take a job with a man I'd known was dangerous had resulted in my baby sister spending hours convinced she was going to die, probably praying for rescue and wondering why I hadn't come sooner, why I hadn't protected her the way I'd promised our mother I would before she died 3 years ago and left me as Mira's only family, her only safety net. The person responsible for ensuring she had the chance at the normal life I'd apparently forfeited the moment I'd signed Dante Reznikov's employment contract. "I'm so sorry, Mira. I never meant for any of this to touch you. I thought I could keep you separate from my work, from the choices I made to ensure you could focus on school without worrying about money. And I was wrong. I was so catastrophically wrong. And if I could go back and choose differently, I would. I would take any other job, any other path, anything that would have kept you safe from this world." Mira pulled back far enough to look at me, her eyes red and swollen from crying, but also sharp with an intelligence that reminded me why she was excelling in one of the most demanding pre-med programs in the country, why professors wrote recommendation letters that described her as exceptional and destined for greatness. And she gripped my shoulders hard enough that I knew I'd have bruises tomorrow, physical, evidence of this conversation to match the emotional scars we were both collecting at a rate that terrified me. "Stop apologizing, Isla," she said, her voice hoarse from screaming or crying, or both, but still carrying that note of steel that had always surprised people who underestimated her, because she looked delicate, looked like she needed protecting, looked like she couldn't possibly have survived everything we'd been through before I'd taken this job. "This isn't your fault. None of this is your fault. The men who took me made that choice. The people who used me to hurt you made that choice. And the only person who needs to apologize is whoever decided that threatening an innocent college student was an acceptable strategy in whatever war they're fighting with your boss, who I'm assuming is the terrifyingly intense man who personally carried me out of that building, while half of New York seemed to be burning down around us, and who looks at you like you're simultaneously the most precious and most dangerous thing he's ever encountered." The observation about how Dante looked at me hit harder than it should have, landed in territory I wasn't ready to explore, while my sister was still traumatized, and we were still in danger, and everything felt like it was balanced on the edge of chaos that could tip either direction depending on variables I didn't control. And I found myself looking around for him, needing to see him, even though that need itself was its own kind of danger, its own admission of feelings I'd been denying since the moment he'd told me over breakfast that I mattered to him, that trust was more valuable than territory, that 18 months of proximity had created something neither of us had intended or expected or knew how to navigate. He was across the room in deep conversation with Mikhail and several other men, whose faces I recognized from the office, but whose roles I'd never examined too closely because ignorance had seemed safer than knowledge when it came to the operational details of Dante's empire. And even from this distance I could see the tension in his shoulders, the barely controlled fury in the set of his jaw, the way his hands kept flexing like he wanted to break something or someone, preferably the people who'd orchestrated this situation, as though he could feel my gaze. And maybe he could, because the awareness between us seemed to operate on frequencies that had nothing to do with normal sensory input. Dante looked up, and our eyes met across the crowded safe house, and what passed between us in that moment felt like a conversation conducted entirely without words, a whole dialogue about fear and relief, and the complicated tangle of feelings that had been building for 18 months and had finally erupted into something neither of us could ignore or deny or pretend was simply professional regard between employer and employee. He excused himself from the conversation with a gesture that sent his men scattering to execute whatever orders he'd given, and he crossed the space between us with that predatory grace that reminded me he was dangerous in ways that went beyond organizational power, beyond the ability to command armies of criminals, dangerous because he made me want things I shouldn't want, made me consider futures I had no business imagining, made me willing to accept consequences that would have horrified the version of myself that had walked into his office 18 months ago, looking for a job that paid well enough to support my sister's education. "How is she?" Dante asked, his attention flickering briefly to Mira before returning to me, and I saw genuine concern in his expression. Not the performance of concern, but actual worry about a girl he'd never met before tonight, except perhaps in background checks and financial records, where she appeared as my dependent. My responsibility. My reason for needing the salary he offered, and the fact that he cared about her well-being because she mattered to me, said more about his feelings than any confession could have, made my heart do complicated things that I absolutely didn't have time or emotional capacity to examine. "She's strong," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. "Stronger than she should have to be, stronger than anyone should have to be at 20 years old, but she'll survive this because she survived worse and because I won't let what happened tonight define her future, or limit her potential, or derail the dreams she's been working toward since she was 12 years old and decided she wanted to be a surgeon who specialized in pediatric trauma because she understood what it felt like to need help and not have access to it." Something shifted in Dante's expression, some layer of the controlled facade cracking to reveal the man underneath, and he reached for me without seeming to think about the fact that we had an audience. that his men were watching, that my sister was sitting right there, taking in every detail of this interaction with the kind of clinical observation skills that would serve her well in medical school, but that I desperately wished she would turn off for just a few minutes, so I could have this moment without worrying about the analysis that would inevitably follow. His hand cupped my face with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone whose hands I'd just watched orchestrating violence, whose orders had resulted in the building where Mira had been held, burning like a beacon, visible from miles away, whose capacity for ruthlessness I'd witnessed firsthand and would probably feature in nightmares for years to come. And yet his touch was careful, reverent almost, like I was something that might break if he wasn't cautious, like I was valuable in ways that had nothing to do with my organizational skills or my ability to manage his schedule. "I'm going to end this," he said, and there was a promise in his voice that made me believe him despite the impossibility of what he was suggesting, despite the fact that the Calabrese family was one of the oldest and most powerful criminal organizations on the East Coast. And you didn't simply end them without triggering consequences that would ripple through the underworld for generations. I'm going to make sure that no one, not the Calabrese family, not any of my enemies, not anyone in this city or any other city where my influence reaches, ever thinks about using someone you love as leverage against me again. And when I'm finished, when the message has been delivered and understood by everyone who needs to understand it, you and your sister will be able to walk anywhere in this city without fear, without looking over your shoulders, without wondering if someone might decide that hurting you is an acceptable way to hurt me. The declaration should have frightened me, should have reminded me exactly what kind of man was touching me with such gentleness while promising wholesale slaughter. But instead I felt something loosen in my chest, some knot of tension I hadn't realized I was carrying suddenly releasing, because he was offering me something I hadn't known I needed. Not just safety, but the certainty of it. Not just protection, but the assurance that it would be permanent, absolute, backed by the kind of reputation that made people think twice before crossing established boundaries. "What will that cost you?" I asked, because nothing in his world came free, because every action had consequences, and every display of power created ripples that could become waves that eventually swamped even the most carefully constructed empires. And I needed to know what he was sacrificing, what he was risking, what this was going to mean for the carefully maintained balance of power that kept his organization functioning and his enemies at bay. What will protecting me cost your business, your alliances, your ability to operate in a world where weakness is punished and sentiment is exploited by anyone clever enough to identify it and ruthless enough to use it? His smile was sharp and cold, and absolutely terrifying in its implications. The expression of a man who'd already calculated costs and decided they were acceptable, who'd run scenarios and determined that the benefits outweighed the risks, who'd made a choice that couldn't be unmade and was at peace with whatever consequences followed from that decision. "Everything," Dante said simply, his thumb tracing the line of my cheekbone with a tenderness that made my breath catch. "And nothing, because the kind of demonstration I'm about to make will either cement my position as someone who cannot be challenged without catastrophic consequences, or it will trigger a war that reshapes the entire criminal landscape of the Northeast. And either outcome is acceptable because the alternative, existing in a world where you're vulnerable, where your sister is vulnerable, where anyone can reach the things I've decided belong to me, that alternative is completely unacceptable, worth any price, worth any risk, worth burning everything I've built, if that's what protecting you requires." The war that Dante promised lasted exactly 72 hours, 3 days of orchestrated violence that played out across the city, like a brutal symphony, conducted by a maestro who understood that true power wasn't about the ability to inflict damage, but about the willingness to follow through on promises with such devastating completeness that no one would ever question your word again. And I watched from the relative safety of his mansion, because the safe house had been temporary, a waypoint between danger and whatever came next. And what came next was apparently me moving permanently into the bedroom where I'd first woken up wearing his nightgown. The bedroom that smelled like him, and felt like safety in ways my Brooklyn apartment never had even before men with guns had invaded it looking for leverage against a man they'd catastrophically underestimated. Mira stayed with us during those 3 days, sleeping in a guest suite down the hall while she processed everything that had happened with the help of a trauma therapist Dante had somehow located within hours of the extraction. And I spent my time divided between checking on my sister and watching Dante dismantle the Calabrese family's operations with the kind of precision that would have been beautiful if it weren't so absolutely terrifying, each move calculated to cause maximum damage while minimizing collateral casualties. Because even in war, he had principles. Even in vengeance, he drew lines he wouldn't cross. On the morning of the 4th day, when the news was full of stories about a gang war that had miraculously resulted in almost no civilian casualties, despite the scope of the violence, when the FBI was launching investigations that would go nowhere because Dante's connections ran deeper than federal jurisdiction, when the remnants of the Calabrese family had formally requested a sit-down to discuss terms of surrender, because they'd finally understood that continuing to fight was simply choosing how many more of their people would die before the inevitable conclusion. Dante found me standing on the terrace overlooking those impossibly perfect grounds, where peacocks still strutted like nothing had changed, like the world hadn't been remade in the past week, according to specifications written in blood and determination, and the kind of love that was too dangerous to name, but too powerful to deny. "It's finished," he said, coming to stand beside me close enough that our shoulders touched, close enough that I could feel the heat of him, the solid reality of him, the presence that had somehow become essential to my ability to breathe properly. "The Calabrese family has been absorbed into our operations. Their territory now flies our flag. Their remaining soldiers have sworn loyalty or found employment elsewhere, and the message has been delivered so clearly that I've already received calls from 3 other families assuring me they have no territorial ambitions that conflict with mine, and would very much like to maintain peaceful relations." I should have felt triumph at this declaration, should have been celebrating the fact that my sister was safe, and the threat had been neutralized, and life could return to some version of normal. But instead I felt the weight of what had been done in my name, the violence that had been unleashed because someone had made the mistake of using me as a weapon against Dante, the lives that had been ended or irrevocably altered because I mattered to him in ways that made him willing to reshape the criminal landscape of an entire city. "How many people died?" I asked, because I needed to know, needed to understand the true cost of the protection he'd offered, needed to quantify what my safety and my sister's safety had cost in terms of human lives even, if those lives had belonged to people who'd made their own choices about which side of various moral lines they were willing to stand. And his answer when it came was delivered with the kind of honesty I'd learned to expect from him. Brutal truth without sugarcoating or attempts to shield me from realities he knew I was strong enough to handle. 17, Dante said, his voice carrying no emotion, simply stating facts the way he might report quarterly earnings or shipping manifests. 17 people who were directly involved in your sister's kidnapping or who chose to fight rather than surrender when given the opportunity. And before you torture yourself with guilt about those deaths, before you start cataloging the ways this is somehow your fault, I need you to understand that every single one of them made choices that led to that outcome, chose loyalty to a dying organization over survival, chose to continue fighting a war. They couldn't win because pride mattered more than life, and their deaths, while regrettable in the abstract way that any death is regrettable, were necessary to ensure that the message I was sending couldn't be misinterpreted or dismissed as empty posturing. His hand found mine on the terrace railing, fingers lacing through mine with the easy familiarity of something we'd done 1,000 times, instead of a gesture that was still new enough to make my heart race. And I found myself leaning into his solid presence, accepting the comfort he offered even as I struggled with the moral implications of being the reason 17 people no longer existed. 17 families that would mourn losses I'd indirectly caused by accepting a job 18 months ago that had seemed like nothing more than an opportunity to support my sister's education. "Where do we go from here?" I asked, because that seemed like the only question that mattered now that the immediate crisis had been resolved, now that Mira was safe and healing and already talking. about returning to Columbia for the spring semester with the kind of resilience that made me proud and terrified in equal measure, now that Dante had proven beyond any doubt that he would burn down the world to protect what he considered his, and I had apparently been elevated to that category somewhere along the way, without entirely realizing it was happening. What happens now that you've declared war on one of the most established families on the East Coast, and one, now that everyone knows your assistant is important enough to you, that threatening her triggers the kind of response usually reserved for attacks on your immediate family? Now that I can't pretend I'm just an employee who happens to be very good at managing your schedule and organizing your files, because we both know that stopped being true, somewhere between waking up in your bedroom and watching you orchestrate a rescue operation that will probably be studied in criminal justice classes for decades as an example of disproportionate response? The question encompassed so much more than just logistics or professional boundaries, asked about feelings that had been building for 18 months and had finally erupted into something that couldn't be ignored or dismissed or explained away as simply the natural bonding that occurred between people who spent enormous amounts of time together in high-stress situations. Dante turned to face me fully, both his hands coming up to frame my face with a gentleness that still surprised me every time I encountered it. This capacity for tenderness from someone whose reputation was built on ruthlessness, and his gray eyes held mine with an intensity that made the rest of the world fade away until there was nothing but this moment, this choice, this crossroads where I could either step back into something resembling my old life or step forward into whatever he was offering, that came with silk sheets and armed guards, and the absolute certainty that I would never be unsafe again as long as he drew breath. "I'm offering you a choice, Isla," he said, his voice dropping to that intimate register that made me feel like we were the only two people in existence. A real choice this time, not one made under duress or in the middle of crisis, but a genuine decision about what you want your life to look like going forward. And I need you to understand what I'm asking before you answer, because once you make this choice, once you step fully into my world not as an employee but as my partner, my equal, the person who stands beside me when decisions are made and strategies are formed, and the future of everything I've built is determined, there's no going back, no returning to the simple division between boss and assistant, no pretending that what exists between us is anything other than what it actually is. The pause that followed felt enormous, weighted with implications that would echo through whatever remained of my life, and I thought about the girl I'd been when I'd walked into his office for that first interview, desperate for money to support Mira's education, but still clinging to the comfortable fiction that I could work for a criminal organization without becoming complicit in its operations, without compromising my values, without fundamentally changing who I was at my core. That girl seemed impossibly naive from this vantage point, separated from her by 18 months and a kidnapping, and the discovery that I was capable of accepting violence when it protected people I loved, that I could stand beside a man whose hands were stained with blood, and not just accept him, but want him with an intensity that should have frightened me but instead felt like the first honest thing I'd allowed myself to feel in years, the first time I'd stopped performing the version of myself I thought I should be, and simply existed as who I actually was beneath all the carefully constructed respectability. "I choose this," I said, and my voice came out clear and certain, carrying no hesitation or doubt, because somewhere in the past week, I'd discovered that I was tired of pretending, tired of living half a life in service to ideals about morality that didn't account for the messy reality of survival in a world that wasn't designed to protect people like me and Mira. Tired of denying that Dante Reznikov, with all his danger and complexity and capacity for both violence and unexpected gentleness, was exactly what I wanted, even if wanting him meant accepting things about myself I'd spent years pretending didn't exist. I choose you. I choose standing beside you. I choose being part of decisions and strategies and the complicated empire you've built. And I choose doing it with my eyes open, fully aware of what that means, what it costs, what it says about who I am and who I'm willing to become. His smile in response to my declaration was devastating, transforming his face from merely handsome to absolutely beautiful. And he kissed me, there on the terrace with the morning sun painting everything gold. Kissed me like I was oxygen, and he'd been drowning. Kissed me like the past 18 months of restraint had been leading inevitably to this moment. And I kissed him back, with all the pent-up longing I'd been denying, with all the feelings I'd refused to name, with the certainty that this was exactly where I was supposed to be, even if the path that had led me here was paved with moral compromises and difficult choices, and the kind of transformation that couldn't be undone. 6 months later, I stood in that same terrace wearing a dress that cost more than my first car, surrounded by people whose criminal enterprises probably funded small countries, and married Dante Reznikov in a private ceremony that somehow managed to be both beautiful and slightly terrifying, because the guest list read like a who's who of organized crime on the East Coast, and I was now permanently, irrevocably connected to all of it, not as a passive observer but as an active participant, as someone who'd discovered that I had my own capacity for ruthlessness when protecting what I'd claimed as mine. Mira stood beside me as my maid of honor, healthy and healed, and already making plans for her future that included medical school and research, and changing the world in ways that had nothing to do with the darkness I'd chosen to inhabit. And watching her smile, seeing her safe and thriving and free from the trauma that might have destroyed someone less resilient, I knew that every compromise I'd made, every line I'd crossed, every aspect of my old self that I'd shed like a skin that no longer fit had been worth it for this, for her safety, for the future she deserved, for the love I'd found in the most unexpected place with the most impossible person. And as Dante slipped a ring onto my finger that marked me as his queen in a kingdom built on shadows and secrets, I realized that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is exactly what your heart demands, and sometimes the truest version of yourself is the one you discover when you finally stop pretending to be someone you're not, and accept the beautiful, complicated, morally ambiguous truth of who you've always been, underneath the comfortable lies we tell ourselves about goodness and safety, and the price we're willing to pay for the things that matter most.